All right, so now we're going to talk about the citric acid cycle, which is where we're going to convert acetyl-CoA into more energy. Okay, this is a part important. So first of all, just linking it to the last two, we talked about glycolysis and then pyruvate catabolism. How the end product of both of those steps would have been starting with glucose and creating acetyl-CoA. So that will get linked into the citric acid cycle. The citric acid cycle is also going to be important when we talk about lipids as well, because we have this beta oxidation of lipids that also creates acetyl-CoA that goes into the citric acid cycle. Okay, so the citric acid cycle plays an important role in both carbohydrate metabolism, but also lipid metabolism. And we haven't talked about beta oxidation yet, so don't worry. We don't know the details of that, but just to give you guys a heads up. Okay, so the citric acid cycle is again going to connect with the other catabolic pathways that we've talked about for carbohydrates and what we will soon talk about with lipids. And yes, so we're going to now talk about what happens to acetyl-CoA as it enters the citric acid cycle. This again takes place within the mitochondria. It also requires aerobic conditions, right? So we couldn't even get our acetyl-CoA unless we had aerobic conditions. Furthermore, we can't go through the citric acid cycle unless we have aerobic conditions, which is a fancy way of saying oxygen must be present. What we're going to see is that acetyl-CoA gets oxidized and what's released is carbon dioxide. This also produces NADH and FADH2, which will go on to the electron transport chain and produce ATP. Okay, so this is another way of indirectly creating energy in the form of NADH and FADH. Yeah, the other thing that you will hear this called is the TCA cycle or the Krebs cycle, depending on what textbook you use, but we're going to call it the citric acid cycle. Okay, and then it's got one, citric acid is formed as an intermediate. We're not going to worry about those intermediates too much. Importantly, the citric acid cycle is known as 6 carbons move through the citric acid cycle producing CO2. 2 molecules of CO2. That's each turn of the citric acid cycle. We'll see it's a cycle here. We also have 4 oxidation reactions, which will produce this NADH and FADH, and then it directly produces 1 molecule of GTP, which is quickly converted to ATP. So we say that there's a direct production of energy in the citric acid cycle of 1 ATP. Okay, so let's take a look at the citric acid cycle here. Again, we have entering this cycle is acetyl-CoA. That is going to be, we don't really need to know the individual steps, but just to kind of go through it briefly. That's going to be linked up to a molecule of oxaloacetate to create the 6-carbon citrate. Later on in the next step, we have our first energy production step where we have 1 molecule of NADH generated. While that's generated, it releases a molecule of CO2. We have in the next step, another molecule of NADH generated, again releasing CO2. So that's where our 2 CO2s come from. We have this GTP generated, but again, that quickly gets converted to ATP. So this is our direct creation of energy in the form of ATP. FAD is reduced to FADH. So we have 1 molecule of that. And then in our last step here, we have our 3rd NADH that's created, right? So we have an input of acetyl-CoA, an output of 3 NADHs, 1 FADH, and 1 ATP. That's the output of a single turn of the citric acid cycle. And remember, glucose is being broken up into 2 molecules of pyruvate, which are then going to be converted into 2 molecules of acetyl-CoA. So per molecule of glucose, you have 2 turns of the citric acid cycle. Just like before, we can see it happens in a series of steps. each one of these steps is catalyzed by a different enzyme. I'm making an executive decision to not have you guys focus on the individual steps or what enzymes are catalyzing them. Okay, so here's our net reaction here. And again, the important parts are the acetyl-CoA being converted into 3 NADH, 1 FADH, and 1 GTP, which again, we're going to actually just call ATP because that's what we care about in terms of our energy currency. Okay, and also per turn of the citric acid cycle, you should know that there are 2 molecules of CO2 that are released. Okay, I'm just kind of glossing over these other parts because they're important for balancing your chemical reaction, but they're not the energy that's created, which is the big focus of all these reactions. All right, so let's summarize what we have here based on all of our metabolic components that we're talking about. Starting out with glucose, we had 2 ATP and 2 NADH that was generated along with 2 pyruvate. So those 2 pyruvate now go into the pyruvate catabolism step. Remember, glycolysis happens in the cytosol. That pyruvate that's generated then gets moved into the mitochondria. All of this business now is happening within the mitochondria. Okay, so 2 molecules of pyruvate would produce 2 acetyl-CoA and 4 and and 2 NADH. Okay, and then we have that acetyl-CoA entering into the citric acid cycle. Per turn of the citric acid cycle, we get 3 NADH, 1 FADH, and 1 ATP. But of course, it's going through twice because we have 2 acetyl-CoAs per glucose. So now that's 2 ATPs, 6 NADH, and 2 FADH. Okay. So if we sort of sum everything up until this point, you'll see that we have the 2 ATPs, that's our direct, our 4 ATPs, that's like our direct payoff, 4 ATPs. But then we have 2 FADH and 10 NADH. And again, the whole idea is that these are going to be further metabolized in what we call the electron transport chain into ATP. All right, so through linking these 3 different metabolic processes, we get a direct payout of 4 ATP, and then this indirect payout of 2 FADHs and 10 NADHs, which will be converted to ATP in the electron transport chain. Okay, so how many of each molecules are produced in 1 turn of the citric acid cycle? This is the important part. This is what I want you guys to know about these different metabolic processes. We don't have to know the individual steps. We don't have to know that it's citrate and then isocitrate, whatever. We don't have to know the enzymes that are doing all the work. We need to know the net result of these reactions, of these different metabolic steps. That's why I'm over and over and over again going over that sort of thing in these lectures. So how many molecules of each of these are converted per turn of the citric acid cycle? That's what you really want to know. For CO2, there were 2. You can go back to our little master diagram here and convince yourself of that. That indeed there are 2 steps that release CO2. So that would be 2. For the NADH, we would get 3 and 1 FADH and 1 GTP, which again, we're saying is really ATP. That's what we really care about. Okay.